Hello, everyone, and welcome to Dream Leapers with Harriette Cole. I am always happy to be in community with you to bring incredible guests who will inspire us to our greatness. And today is no exception. I've been actually waiting for this book to come out so that I could talk to this dynamic author. You know, I love talking to authors. This woman has poured her heart and soul into a book of essays that really speak to the Black experience in a unique way. Her book is called Black Joy: Stories of Resistance, Resilience, and Restoration. And she is writer and educator Tracey Michae'l Lewis-Giggetts, and she offers all who read her work and hear her speak an authentic experience, an opportunity to explore the intersection of culture, identity, and faith or spirituality, however you know it, at the deepest levels. She is a professor of English and Black Studies at the Community College of Philadelphia. She is the founder of Heart Space, a healing community created to serve those who have experienced trauma of any kind through the use of storytelling and the arts. Now, as an author, Tracy has published 15 books, including several collaborations with numerous high profile authors. In 2016, she was honored by She Knows Media as one of the Voices of the Year for her nuanced and personal exploration of mental health, PTSD, and self care. In 2021, Tracy became one of 20 writers who contributed to the groundbreaking book, You Are Your Best Thing: Vulnerability, Shame, Resilience, and the Black Experience. She's done so much, but this new book that has just come out right now, Black Joy: Stories of Resistance, Resilience, and Restoration, is what gives me the distinct honor of bringing Tracy on to Dream Leapers. Let us welcome Tracy right now. Hi.
Hi,
I'm
how
so
are
happy
you?
to have you.
I'm so happy to be here. It's such an honor. Thank you.
Absolutely. So 15 books, girl. What?
I've been working.
And working. And you're not just writing light stuff.
Yeah.
You are probing deep into the heart and soul of our culture, which is a difficult thing to do. And this particular book goes very deep.
Hmm.
And you know that I recently talked to Iyanla Van Zant, and she differentiated, as you do in your book, between happiness and joy. And I know last year, 2021, there were so many Black people claiming this notion of Black joy, which
Hmm.
was really interesting because it was in the midst of racial reckoning, still under the umbrella of quarantine
Hmm.
with COVID-19. And, I think under that umbrella, there was a lot percolating. And among the atrocities, there was a greater emergence of Black joy, that, okay, in the middle of all this other stuff, I can claim joy. So for you, how would you define Black joy, and what is different between joy and happiness?
Mm, very good question. When I think about Black joy, I think about both the experience, the embodied experience that we all have as human beings, right? This idea that we can tap into. Physiologically, it's the dopamine hit, right? It's this feelings, the things that are happening in our body when we are experiencing pleasure, when we are having a moment where we see ourselves reflected back to us and it's good, right? And that can be in any scenario. So that's a universal human experience. Where Black joy comes to play is that it's that experience that sits in the context of our historical, our social dynamic in this country and around the world. So it's all of that universal stuff that has to live in this place of resilience, in a kind of resistance. I know that's sort of the catchphrase, Black joy is resistance, but it's really the way that we heal ourselves in the midst of very traumatic experiences. When you talk about happiness versus joy, I look at happiness as a moment by moment experience. So, I remember the time when we went to Six Flags when I was a young person, and that idea of getting on roller coaster and that moment of happiness, right? And it's gray area because it's very similar. It has the same physiological response. But I think what joy is an undercurrent, meaning that joy lives beneath whatever the actual external circumstances happens to be, right? So it's being able, for instance, the protests from summer 2020, where you have people who are, chanting and there's confrontation and we're walking and we're, demanding, to be seen, that our rights would be seen, in the midst of all that we're seeing around police brutality. But in the midst of that, I love the images of people dancing and people singing. And a couple in Philadelphia got married in the middle of the protest.
You wrote about that in your book. I thought that was so brilliant because, for those who, many of us saw the protests through an aerial view from a news camera.
Yes.
Some of us were in the mix, walking, protesting out there, holding a flag or just simply being present. Uh, for those who weren't there, what most of the news reports suggested one of two things. One was that it was violent, and we know there was very little violence,
Right.
although, as you point out in your book, well, violence is part of that too.
Yes.
Sometimes, that emotion has to erupt and it turns into all kinds of things because it can't always be contained when the outrage is too great. But also, as you described, that there were engagements, there was a wedding, that there's a spontaneous music that comes from the soul. And we know that goes all the way back to the freedom marches of our grandparents,
Absolutely.
which is so incredibly powerful that we could access joy
Hmm.
even when so much sadness and death and pain is surrounding us, is sort of throbbing, but that joy could throb through, more clearly. Now, in your book, which you call Black Joy: Stories of Resistance, Resilience, and Restoration, this is a very personal book. And, when I started reading it, I started weeping.
Mm.
You do not start out, oh, this is
Right.
joy. Let me play a violin. It's there's tremendous sadness,
Yeah.
and talk about that.
Yeah. One of the things that I was very intentional about is that I love the way Black joy is hashtagged on social media. I love the images of laughter and spades games and all the cultural things I love that. But to have a more nuanced look at it. I wanted to use my own personal experience as a way to enter exploring what Black joy really is, like what the core of it is. And so that required me to do some digging. The genesis of this book was me in a therapist's office trying to figure out what joy felt like in my body, and being on this earth for well over 40 years and not really being able to say, oh, this is what joy feels like. And that was a homework assignment that was given to me as a therapist. I mean, to me from my therapist.
Mhm.
And I um went on a journey, right? And so then I never wanted to make my personal experience so the definitive experience of Black joy, but I wanted to use it to say, okay, I've been seeing this all my life. I've seen grandmama rocking in church after a week of trauma, of a week of, experiences that we wouldn't classify as happy or joyous. And yet she found a way to laugh or to speak out, back to the pastor, or, rock and move those feelings, those emotions out of her body. And so I've been seeing this all along. I just couldn't put a name to it. I couldn't name it. I couldn't really identify it or classify it as Black joy. So it required me to do some digging. And so I began to just unpack my life and, as some people say, bleed on the page. Um,
You
but,
did.
well, I wanted that sorrow,
It's there. It's
to be
palpable.
turned inside out, basically.
And you also turn a number of stereotypes inside out
Mm.
in a creative way. So I want to give you kudos for being a very skilled writer.
Thanks.
I appreciate your writing style and, without judgment, leading us into experiences. And so, one particular thing I'm talking about, and I'll lead up to it in this way. I remember being at a conference. I don't remember which the conference was, but it was a Black People's Conference, Black Professional Conference. And at some point, uh, the identity of Black teen parents came up, and instantly, in this group of Black professionals, there were all kinds of judgments being hurled back and forth about, well, what happens to teen moms, and they never will amount to anything, and it's too hard for them to go to college. What all of the stereotypes that exist.
Yeah.
And someone stood up, and this was a brave someone, and said, I was a teen mom, and here's what I've done. And I resent all of you passing judgment. Like a lot of us were, or our mothers or grandmothers were, and you don't know our stories, so stop passing judgment.
Right.
So I'm saying that as the precursor to, you didn't even call your mother or grandmother teen moms, but you figure it out when you read your book. When you
Mhm.
talk about your grandma, Granny, is that what you called her?
Yeah, Granny.
Granny. And so, you call somebody granny, you expect your mind goes to a little plump, sweet, you know, kind of plain but lovely person who's
Hmm.
old.
Hmm.
Your granny wasn't old, nor was she plain, nor was she round. She wasn't any of those things, but she
No, she
was
was
a
not.
teen mom, right?
Yes.
And which means your mom must have been a teen mom.
Yes. My mom was a teen mom. My grandmother was married, but she was 18 when she had
But she
her
was still a
oldest
teen
child. She
mom.
was
Right.
absolutely a teenager. Um, and yes, uh, my grandmother was fabulous.
Mhm.
And she did not adhere to, the images that we see of Black grandmothers at all. She reveled in her bouginess. For sure. But I also learned so much about the way that she, in hindsight, I learned this, managed her life, reinvented herself over and over again. Um, Figured, good or bad, figured out ways to manage depression and anxiety and all of those things that she battled in her life, and still told the story as much as she could, as much as she could let go of, right? That generation, the greatest generation or silent generation, they couldn't, a lot of times they didn't feel comfortable being as vulnerable as maybe I am now because of social media or
Sure.
whatever. But she laid the groundwork for me. And so just thinking about her and the essay that I wrote just always brings tears to my eyes.
Well, it brought tears to my eyes too for so many reasons, including just this stereotype busting that you do throughout the book. Again, without judgment, just telling stories and showing, we come in all different sizes, shapes, ages, ways of living and being in the world. And I think that's part of the embrace of Black joy, just that we are not a monolith, not
Absolutely.
by a long shot.
Not at all.
You
And it's a
know,
form of humanization too. Like I wanted to
Absolutely.
humanize the breadth and depth of our experiences, that, she could travel the world, with this family and live and, make her risotto instead of white rice or whatever, But then I also, I guess contrast that with the experience of my great grandmother, who was from the South, from Alabama, and had some of those more typical or normalized or traditional, ways of being.
Mhm.
But even in her telling of her stories, you can't pinpoint it, you can't judge it and say it is a single thing. So yeah, I'm so glad you picked up on that, because that was extremely important to me.
Yeah, it's so important for us to look through compassionate eyes,
Yes.
look through eyes that say, I am here to learn, not to judge,
Yes.
which can be challenging because we live in a judgmental world. Let me remind folks, you are listening to Dream Leapers with Harriette Cole here on WBAI in New York City. That's 99.5 FM and everywhere online at WBAI.org. I'm always excited about the online presence because this is a traditional radio station that's been around now. This is the 61st year, which is amazing. In COVID, we are still here. One of the oldest progressive radio stations in New York City, and we can reach everybody through our online presence. Today, we have the honor of talking with a wonderful author. Her name is Tracey Michae'l Lewis-Giggetts. Her book is Black Joy: Stories of Resistance, Resilience, and Restoration. A really moving book that, for me, came at a really important time. I feel like right now, Tracey, our emotions have been stirred up. There's a
Yes.
lot of loss, there's a lot of sorrow, there's a lot
Mhm.
of anger, there's a lot of hope.
Yes,
Like the stew has a lot of ingredients, and it feels like the heat has been turned up.
for
And
sure.
your book, with each of these essays, each of which is short, just long enough to get us to turn the heat up, and then it's like, ooh, okay, now she gave me this one. So all right, what do I do with that? And then here's another. So one of the things that you talk about early on is abuse.
Mhm.
And you describe your experience of abuse beautifully, not too much, but enough for us to understand. Uh, Sadly, so many of us have experienced abuse in one way or another. Tell us about this unfortunate experience in your life.
Yeah. As a child, I um, was a victim of sexual abuse, childhood sexual abuse. I, as an adult, experienced sexual assault. I am that 1 in 4 number that gets thrown out a lot. And part of it, it's amazing, I think, how our lives, kind of the trajectory of our lives, and how we end up in a place. Because part of my joy work was had to do with two things: me working through all of the residue and all the impact of that unresolved trauma from my childhood. So I'm in therapy and I'm working on the ways in which the trauma and how I move through the world today is impacted by that child, that little girl. And at the same time, dealing with grief. I had, dealt with some racial violence in my family. And so those two things actually led me to joy.
Mm.
And so
How? How?
well, I think because I was giving voice to it. I think there's power in giving voice to the story. And even if it's just in a therapeutic context, right? I'm
Is
talking
that how
about it.
it started, Tracy? In therapy, was it there that you were able to acknowledge that you had been abused, starting from as a child?
I had already talked about my abuse, but as a writer, I think there was still some distance between me talking about it and me doing the inner work for a
Mm.
long time. So I had been very vocal and very active. I've written for the Me Too movement. I'd done all of that sort of external acknowledgement of what had happened to me.
Hmm.
At the same time, though, I had not quite gotten to the point where I could deal with all of the stuff that was coming up in me and in my relationships and in all of, all of my life as a
Hmm.
result of the unresolved, unhealed parts of me.
Hmm.
And that is, I think, so vocalizing it in therapy with the intention of healing is where I think was where therapy was the starting point for me. But I talked about it long before. But I mean, I think we do that, right? Like we can talk about a thing. We can say, oh, this happened to me. Oh, I grew up here. Oh,
Right.
that, without actually doing the work to
I'm glad
unpack
you're
it.
saying that because a lot of people think, and by the way, it is important to articulate it, but articulation is not enough.
Yes.
Did you, in your talking about it, did you ever confront your abuser?
I have.
Hmm.
Yeah. And I
And
think
how did that, what happened? Because often that is an unsatisfying experience.
it usually is. And I
Hmm.
think um even if you get what you think you want, which is the apology or the accountability or the justice, so to speak. um it doesn't change, and I don't like to use the word damage, but it doesn't change what actually has to be undone and unlearned in you as a result. So as a result of that, I spent a good amount of my life um thinking that I had to perform for love, thinking
Mhm.
that, because in my situation, I talk about this in the book. I was removed from the household, and then I had to figure out what it meant to be protected and to be loved. And so I began to seek that for, through my 20s, and all of that began to like try to figure out, okay, I have to uh, dance a jig, if you will, or perform constantly, hustle for my worthiness, as Brene Brown
Mhm.
says, in order to get people to see me, to feel worthy enough, right? And so that piece of it, no amount of apology or accountability or anything can take away the years of me doing that to myself and having to unravel from that. And so I think, yes, I did do that work of sort of, confrontation and all of that. I don't know, even to this day, um, if I needed it.
Mm. And you created an outlet for others. Heart Space is it called?
Yes.
Uh, who are dealing with trauma.
Hmm.
Tell us about the creation of that effort and what you are doing. Like,
Yes.
how is it supporting others?
Sure. So pre-COVID, I started this entity called Heart Space, which was it started off as a pop-up, where we would just open the doors and create space. We'd have books and we'd have events and all kinds of things where people could come and rest. That's the best way I can describe it. We would have things like listening stations where literally there was a table set up and people can come and sit down and there'd be another person there. And we would consider it a safe or brave space for them, and they could share whatever was on their heart and just
Mm.
have someone listen. That person is not going to judge. That person is not going to even comment unless they're asked to comment. But I felt like a lot of times people just need to voice it. They need to like get it out of their bodies, right? It's been trapped there for so long. We would do storytelling events where people got a chance to like open mic types of things and come and just share their hearts. Not a formalized, I'm going to come and read my poem, but I'm just going to come and tell you a story about my life. And I found that people were really drawn to this sort of informal event, but not really, of being able to share themselves. And so I took that online. And so we had a Facebook group where people could come, and one specifically for sexual assault and sexual abuse, where people felt like they could share their stories, or if something went on in the news. Perfect example, when R. Kelly and the Surviving R. Kelly documentary came out, we held space for each other, right? Because we knew that, while we were glad that, these women were getting their say, it was triggering us, and triggering our experiences. And so we wanted to, comfort each other. COVID has put a little bit of a pause on some of the work, especially the face to face kinds of things. But what I'm hoping to do, my dream, is to actually create a retreat space where
Mm.
people will actually be able to come to Heart Space, for a length of time, and just begin to do that healing work with therapy, but also just, I believe in the power of story, obviously, right? Like I believe in the arts as a way for us to kind of speak into ourselves and speak the stuff that is bothering us out. And so I want to figure out ways to do that. So we're still in the building phases. We had to kind of rebuild after
Mhm.
uh COVID kind of put a stop to everything, but I'm looking forward to that piece of it.
So, what you were doing before and hope to do moving forward, especially if you're bringing together a range of people who've experienced trauma in lots of different ways, uh, it, before when you were doing it and when you move forward, are you including mental health professionals so that if people,
Yes.
when you awaken things
Yes.
in storytelling, sometimes people need professional help.
Yes. And so our goal is we had a list of previously we had a list of black and brown therapists in the area, because most of the community that we served were African American or Latinx individuals. So we wanted to make sure that the dynamic of them speaking to someone could be someone that maybe could identify more with their experience. And in the new iteration of that, I really would love to have someone on site, right? That could be, at least for a portion of the time, be available to someone as they're unpacking this stuff. We did an art where people came in and we brought in an artist and they actually were painting through their pain, so to
Mm.
speak. And it was such an amazing, powerful experience. But what I realized in that moment was like people were really bringing stuff up. And at
Mhm.
that particular moment, we did not have someone on site, although we could provide them with names and telephone numbers. But I'm thinking, like, I want somebody on site who can talk to someone immediately. So that is definitely the goal.
I think it's important
Yeah.
because when you stir it up, you never know what's going to emerge,
Yeah.
and storytelling is powerful. I totally agree with you, but sometimes the story that emerges, you're like, okay, and now what do I do with this, right?
Exactly.
So having the professional support around certainly can help people feel safer in
Yes.
when they're facing whatever has emerged for them. Um, in the space of racial reckoning, this book is talking about the experiences of Black people, and because you lay bare so much of our story, in part there's the feeling of how in the world could I have joy if I just know all the things that have happened, and I know that I'm may be viewed in a particular way based upon how I look. And no matter how I mean, you have a beautiful reference in there about no matter how you change your hair, it doesn't mean that you are going to be more palatable, let's say, in a
Exactly.
particular environment. And I know because one of my uh, jobs in my life was running fashion for Essence,
Yes.
and we worked really hard to help professional women understand how to navigate the corporate world, keep elements of your identity intact, and not scare people so you could have that career and move forward. And in some instances it works, but as you point out, you could straighten your hair if you want to. That doesn't mean that you, with your brown skin, are going to be seen as someone who is less scary, less threatening, or whatever it is that the world of white supremacy suggests.
Right.
How do you balance the judgmental, racist glance
Mhm.
and the ability to access joy in the midst of that?
Yeah. The first thing I think is I realized that the container of our lives has I believe God has given us the ability to hold both grief and pain and joy, right, in the same space. I mean, our people have been doing that for generations. We've been holding, our hard experiences historically and even present day alongside our moments of joy. And we've been able to, I mean, I think, if I had to guess, I would say that that is the crux, that is the foundation of our resilience, is being able to do that. Um, I think for me personally, I say this all the time, my code switching button is broken. And so I think I spent a lot of time in my early career in corporate doing the thing, right? Like trying to balance giving them a little bit of taste of blackness, but making sure that I could be presentable in all the ways that they had defined presentable to be. And I think I'd gotten to the point as I moved into academia and then also just working for myself where I just it felt like too much of a give. It felt like too much of a sacrifice. And I didn't want to do it anymore. And I said, I'm going to show up as I am. It's not going to change anything about how many, my education, my background, my level of intelligence, none of that. But I'm going to show up in these door knocker earrings. I'm going to show up, with my cherry red extensions. I'm going to show up and still be excellent, right? Undeniably excellent, right? And I think that's sort of the key, right? Like you can show up, but you also have to be, as we have learned over time, because of this white supremacist culture, twice as good, right? To
That's
be
it.
to get half as much. So I'm gonna show up excellent, but you're gonna get all of this of who I am. And it was a risk, and I understand my privilege in being able to do that, right? Because not everybody can. Um, but I just made the choice for myself that I just would not give any more of myself than I really had to. And what I figured out was by showing up excellent with my cherry red extensions, many times I was able to still get the things that I wanted, still get the positions that I wanted. Not without a side eye, not without, conversation being had by my colleagues, but that's okay. But again, I recognize, and I say this in the book, I recognize that not everybody has the ability to be able to break their code switching button forever.
Yours is broken.
Yeah, like I just and then my husband actually pointed out to me, he's like, is it really though? Because because that's so ingrained in us. Like I grew up in Louisville, Kentucky, right? Like it's ingrained in us that there's just ways that you move in the world that's different when you're at home than when you're somewhere else. And I
And
still think I retain some of that,
of course, of
but not to the extent that I really want or desire to change who, especially externally, how I show up.
course. Hey guys, you're listening to Dream Leapers with Harriette Cole here on WBAI in New York City. That's 99.5 FM and everywhere online at WBAI.org. And we are having a real conversation
Mhm.
with the author of 15 books. Oh, I love that. Her name is Tracey Michae'l Lewis-Giggetts. Her book is Black Joy: Stories of Resistance, Resilience, and Restoration. And what is so appealing, many things are appealing about this book, but there are many essays. They are not long, but they are filled with images. As Tracy said, she's a storyteller. She takes you into an experience so you experience it with her and you can get a glimpse of what it means to walk in the life of an African American woman, scholar, mother, wife, friend, abuse sufferer, a woman with a complete life who has been processing Black life and culture and history and joy for a long time.
Yes.
And so I feel like when you read it, the chapters are short, but it's good because you can read one and then sit back and
Yes.
chew on it and think
Mhm.
about what did I learn here? And how does this story relate to my life and the people I love? Because it's not just Tracy's life, but it's a connection to so many lives. So this book, Tracy so generously offered to us, Black Joy: Stories of Resistance, Resilience, and Restoration. You know that we exist because of the community of folks who are connected right this minute. For those who are listening, and for me and my guests on Dream Leapers, and all the folks who have 24 hours of programming on WBAI, it is because of your generosity that we are on the air. And occasionally, our guests have wonderful gifts to offer us when we make a contribution to our beloved radio station. So I am asking if you would like to have a copy of Black Joy, which Tracy has offered to us, please make a donation of $60 to WBAI, and we will send you a copy of Tracy's book. That this is the beginning of the year. As you all know, for all of us, the beginning of the year, we want to know that the things we love and treasure are going to be there. That we start the year together and that we're going to stay together. The only way WBAI stays here is if we donate to keep it alive because we don't accept any ads. So this time we have a present for you, a wonderful cultural gift. And I want to say for everyone listening, for Black folks listening, white folks, Latinx, Asian American, whoever you are, the stories in here will resonate for you. They will bring a lot of questions up. I used the stew imagery earlier because that's how it feels to me. Like all these wonderful elements have been stirred into the stew, and every now and then it boils. And you're like, woo, what did Tracey do? What does she make me think about now? I don't know if I want to think about that, but it's good to think about that. And she gets you thinking and talking, and that's what I love for Dream Leapers. So if you'd like to have a copy of Black Joy, Stories of Resistance, Resilience, and Restoration, please make a pledge of $60 to WBAI. You can call us at 212-209-2950 or write to us, go to online to give to the numeral 2 WBAI.org and just say that you want a copy of Black Joy and make your $60 donation, and we will send you a copy of Tracey's book. Tracey's book just came out. It's brand spanking new, y'all. So you can be among the first to read her book. And what I love now, because I've written a number of books myself, it used to be that you write a book and it doesn't come out for at least a year, sometimes two. This book is quick. She wrote this during COVID. Why do I know that? Because she's got stories about COVID times in this book. Not an overwhelming amount though, because I think we're gonna find this book to be timeless, but also meaningful because she talks about the marches that occurred around the world. When people were standing in protest of George Floyd's murder,
Yeah.
and so many others. And so, Black Joy, Stories of Resistance, Resilience, and Restoration. Please make a contribution of $60, 212-209-2950, or give to WBAI.org. So, Tracey, you talk about someone who is so dear to you. I have a daughter as well,
Yes.
your sweet daughter. And in your promo for the book, we see her dancing in the rain and playing
Yes.
on the playground, and you in a hammock. I mean, you embody joy in that promo, which I love so much. Um, for our children, for our daughters,
Mhm.
what are those lessons that we're supposed to be teaching them when we have violence against Black people, violence against women, injustice when you are a Black woman, female walking through the world? What are the lessons that you teach your daughter and that we should
Mhm.
teach ours so that they are strong and resilient and that they percolate with joy?
Yeah. You know, one of the things that was very important to me, like I'm the, you know, controlling mom. I would love to be able to put her in a bubble so none of these bad things could happen to her. But the truth is, I realized that I can't. And when I lost my cousin to racial violence in 2018, and my daughter was sort of watching me grieve through that process, I realized that I can't hide anymore, what's going on in the world from her. So one of the things that I wanted to teach her, and I continue to teach her, is um, trauma and traumatic events. These things are going to happen. This is our reality. But how do you move it through your body? How do you um, deal with it so that it doesn't turn you inside out, right? That how do you manage your rage? How do you manage your sorrow? And so it's funny that you asked me this, because the day before yesterday, I happened to overhear her. She was very frightened by something, and I heard her in her room by herself saying, I am brave, I am safe, I am calm, all by herself, like with no
And how
prompting.
old is she?
She's 10.
Okay.
And so
Wow.
she was saying it like a mantra all over and over to herself. And it was almost like she was in the process of making herself feel better. She understood that she was scared. She understood that this thing that she was scared of did not exist actually in our home. Right. And just to share what it was, happened to enter the room when I was watching a television show that had a recreation of the Challenger explosion. and she is all about space. She was all about stars and everything, and it really got into her. She was really frightened by that, like, that you can go up in a rocket ship and it's not all wonderful. It's dangerous and that something bad could happen. And so we had talked her through it, but she still was struggling. And just to hear her utilize the tools that I gave her. I said, you can speak to your heart, you can speak to yourself, you can, go outside and do some jumping jacks if you feel like your body is anxious. And so just, I think that is, as much as we teach boundaries, as much as we give them the talk about, driving in the car and getting pulled over, all of those are wonderful, and those are necessary things that we have to do as Black people in this country. But my prayer is that we can also teach our children um, how to heal, right? How to go through the process of dealing with anxiety and dealing with, all the things that come, even with like social media and bullying and all of those kinds of things, so that they can be whole people, even in the midst of all of the terrible things that they have to experience. So,
You just piggybacking on that from something you talk about in your book about contemplation, about
mhm,
the breath, about mantra and meditation. What I particularly like is that you anchor it in African tradition.
yeah.
You talk about African tradition and Eastern tradition and these kind of to the soul experiences and practices that
Yeah.
can help keep people grounded. Um, which is kind of what you've taught your daughter and what she was doing. Can
Mhm,
you speak to the cultural uh, impact of these practices of
mhm.
mantra repetition and contemplation, meditation, prayer, all of that?
What was interesting is, like, I come from a faith background, grew up in the Black Baptist Church, identified as a follower of Jesus, all those kinds of things, right? But as I began to navigate my trauma, I felt like I needed something else that was going to still me in a lot of ways, as I was unpacking all of this stuff. And so I discovered the desert mothers and fathers. I discovered contemplatives. But again, it was very much rooted in sort of these white traditions. And so I was like, this isn't something, these are colonized traditions, right? So I need to figure out, like, where I can see myself in it. And so then I started reading, Howard Thurman and some Black mystics and some Black theologians that had actually tapped into that. And what was so amazing is that once I understood the power of meditation and mantra and stillness and contemplation, I actually began to then look back at my faith tradition, and I'm like, oh, we've been doing this. We didn't have the name
Right,
of,
that's right.
we didn't call it bilateral stimulation or meditation, right? But that rocking is bilateral stimulation that's doing something in our brains and in our bodies, right? That we did in church. That the screaming out in ecstasy or exaltation, I should say, that right there is a physiological thing that happens in our community, right? But it actually has a connection to all these things that I was learning about in terms of, like, contemplation. When we get still, right, and we can quiet our minds and we can hear. This is the same thing that grandma was doing when she said I had to rest my eyes. Let me rest my eyes for 30 minutes, okay? And she's just
That's
sit there
right.
and she close her eyes for 30 minutes, and you're like, as a kid, you're like, granny, but there was a level of stillness. She understood she had to get her stabilizing. She had to stabilize herself. And so I realized that the traditions, there was so much overlap and so much that I was learning, but then was so reflective of what I'd already known, that it just became like this circular kind of experience for me. Um, and I just wish we as Black folks really kind of understood that and more. And that we would embrace that more, because I think sometimes it's semantics, it's language. Like, I'm not messing with that meditation, but you've been meditating. you know.
Hey,
um
owning the power of our culture is so important, and we have been taught for so long that it's not valuable, and so
yes,
or that that's not me. I'm not Afrocentric. I'm not whatever this is. I'm not part of
exactly.
that. And one thing that comes through very clearly in your book is that we can all proudly be part of that. Let me
Yes.
remind folks you are listening to Dream Leapers with Harriette Cole here on WBAI in New York. That's 99.5 FM and everywhere online at WBAI.org. I just love when I get great guests and we just get fuller and fuller and fuller. And I keep describing this as like the gumbo pot because all these good ingredients are going in. And my guest today, Tracey Michae'l Lewis-Giggetts, has written a book, Black Joy, Stories of Resistance, Resilience, and Restoration. There are so many great stories in here. I love that Tracey is a writer first. She's a storyteller, and she's crafted these stories, as I said earlier, in small, bite-sized lengths so that you can read it, sit with it, ingest it, think about it, call your friends and talk about it, or turn the page and keep moving until you feel like you need to sit back for a moment. It's the kind of book that I feel like you could journal after to as you are contemplating your own experiences because Tracey has stirred up so many things. Well, she's made it possible for you to have a copy of this book that just came out. February 1st is the launch date. Black Joy, Stories of Resistance, Resilience, and Restoration. If you would like to have a copy of Tracey's book, please make a contribution today in the amount of $60 to WBAI, and you will be gifted Tracey's book. Our number is 212-209-2950. And you can also write to us at give to the numeral 2 WBAI.org. This is an easy read, easy in the sense of like I said, the chapters are short, the stories are vibrant. Not so easy in the sense that you have to be active. This is not a sit back and read and whatever. It's going to stir your soul, which isn't that what we want? We want to start the year by stirring our soul and then contemplating conscious steps that we can take moving forward. That is what Dream Leapers is all about. So you don't come here to sit back. You come here to lean in and engage. And Tracey's got us all in engaged, which is fantastic. Tracey, there's a story in your book, so many, but one that really struck me because I once had a cat and then two cats. I My original reason for having a cat was exactly the same as yours because I wanted the cat to kill the mouse. I was
Mhm.
scared of cats. I was really not a good cat mom. But you talk about your cat Willow, right?
Yes.
And what I love is that it's the lesson of the cat
Mhm.
and consciousness, I think,
Mhm.
that you kind of address. For pet lovers and non-pet lovers, what was the lesson that you gained from inviting Willow into your world?
Yeah, it took me some time. Me and Willow, we, our relationship is a very interesting one. For like the first year, we just kind of moved around each other and inspected each other. Whereas my daughter and my husband were all like loving and, oh, Willow. Me, I'm just like, you got a job to do. You're a hired employee. Just
Do your job,
running the
girl.
business. But I think what I learned from Willow over time was, I tell the story about how she's very protective of my daughter. And my daughter got sick one day, and how she was not having us lock her away from the three of us as we were tending, to my daughter. And I think what I connected to was that, wow, like somebody is protecting her, right? And because I grew up not often feeling protected, I think I it just made me fall in love. Because it was just, I think animals sometimes, all sentient beings, but definitely animals, have this sense of loyalty, that I struggled with, and then that led me to really understand why in our history pets were often kept from Black folks, right? Which was something that I did not know. As I'm writing this essay, I'm just telling my story and I'm like, there's something else I need to explore here. And then when I began to do my research, I was like, oh, that sense of the emotional support, the sense of loyalty that was being kept from us, right? We weren't allowed to, and a lot of times have that, or those animals were turned against us, right? And if you think
Exactly.
about the dogs of the civil rights movement and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So that was just impactful for me, and I honestly did not know that I'd be writing an essay about Willow. Did not.
That was interesting to see the cat show up in the book. I had to address that. Now, you mentioned several times here and in your book that you are married.
Yes.
And I'd like for you to talk about the journey of being married, especially as one who has suffered abuse. Because sometimes it's hard for people to create a meaningful relationship when they have baggage. Although I'm going to say that everybody has some kind of baggage.
Right.
But how have you, for anybody who wants to be married, who is married, who's on that journey with
Yeah.
a partner, what wisdom can you share about what you have learned about being married, being in partnership with another human being?
Yeah. I I always say I try not to have regrets, but I do think that I've been married now for almost 14 years, and have been with my partner for uh, almost 17 years. And I do think, or if I had a wish, I wish that I had begun doing this work, this trauma work earlier in our marriage, because you're absolutely right. Especially when you're a survivor of sexual assault. Um, there's so many things that we don't realize in terms of intimacy that we deal with, that we bring into our relationships, right? And what's interesting is, if you're bringing baggage, because you said, we all have it, right? And then the other person is bringing baggage. So you not only have your individual baggage, but then you have the baggage that you create together as a result of those individual bags. And now we're just, you know, without any real guidance, we are going back and forth, trading bags without really any resolution or any way of being together in the way that we idealized, right? Like I had an idea of, let's get married and, we're going to have this ideal life. And I would say in like the first few years, all of those images, those ideal, imaginations that I had about it didn't show up that way. And so my husband and I had to begin to do the work and saying, what are we bringing in here that's preventing our joy from us really taking in each other and loving each other in the way that, we each individually need to be loved. And that's been an ongoing work for us.
And
Um,
if there were one takeaway that you could offer to couples who are on that journey, what would that one thing be that you think would be a directional or a salve for their union?
um, I think listening without judgment is one. Um, because we all have, again, those imaginations, those ideals, those we I had a way of thinking that he was supposed to do X, Y, and Z, right? When a lot of what I was asking from him were things that I needed to do for myself. So if there's a part two to listening without judgment, it's that, I mean, I'm a proponent of therapy. I can't say it enough. Like, do some of this work on yourself. We went to couples counseling, and we actually had the counselors say, I need you to go to therapy by yourself, and I need you to go to therapy by yourself, and there's some
Excellent.
work that you guys need to do, then come back to couples counseling, because there was just some stuff that I was wanting from him that I had not realized that it was work that I needed to do on my own. So listen without judgment. And and if it's accessible to you, if it's something that you can do, individually begin to do that work. Because what I discovered is when we both started going individually to therapy, we were much more maybe self-aware in our dynamics with each other, right? So
That's
arguments
beautiful.
look different, right? Because
Mhm.
I was more conscious of what I was doing when I was saying that thing to him, you know?
Conscious awareness is everything. It is only in the moment of conscious awareness that we can make a conscious choice. And
Yes.
when people recognize that, and the degree of consciousness that we can embrace is something that I think we should always be reaching for greater depths. Thank you so much. The book, Black Joy: Stories of Resistance, Resilience, and Restoration. The author, Tracey Michae'l Lewis-Giggetts. Thank you, my dear. And if people want to reach you, how can they learn more about your work? What's your website?
TraceyMLewis.com. All the things are there.
TraceyMLewis.com. And please, everybody, get your copy of Tracey's book. Call us 212-209-2950. Make a $60 contribution today. The book just came out. You can be one of the first people to get a copy of this book. Thank you, dear one. Thank you so
Thank
much. I
you.
appreciate it. Wow, that was fantastic. I highly recommend that you read this book. It's filled with incredible stories that will stir your spirit. Until next time, have a great day and make it count.